This is a poem by Rumi called One Thing I Did Wrong. The bird in the cage of my chest flutters excitedly. My mad camel pulls at its tether. A lion looks out through my eyes and sees quarry. The river rises. Along the bank new grasses appear. Dawn wind blows through the rose garden. Love left because of one thing I did wrong. Now it returns. Compassion curves back here, and lightheartedness. A blind man throws away his cane. A baby begins to eat from the plate. A falcon lifts toward the king's drum. Now a silence unweaves the shroud of words we have woven. That's from a book called Rumi, Bridge to the Soul by Coleman Barks. And I thought this was a nice representation of a few different things. One that we haven't really talked very much about yet is this idea of love left because I did one thing wrong, and all the lines that precede that. My mad camel pulls at its tether. A lion looks out through my eyes and sees quarry. The river rises. This idea that there is a swelling and an inner pursuit that comes naturally to us of some things that are a little bit on the edge of what in the illusory world we would call right versus wrong. And Alan Watts talks about this in the sense of the Yetzer Hara, which comes from the Jewish tradition and is this idea that God implanted man, not meaning males, but meaning humans, with the wayward spirit, or as he says it, irreducible rascality. This idea that there is something ingrained in humans and humankind that tends to lead you in a direction of a little bit of quirkiness or a little bit of malice or a little bit of, say, law-breaking rebellion. And that the degree to which this occurs in different people is obviously particular to different people. That we've talked about numerous times, the reasons why we have wildly varying experiences and instincts and intuitions and that sort of thing. But here is this idea that, Rumi is sort of letting these things sort of come out and he's feeling them strongly, and then one thing happens wrong, or he does one thing wrong, and love left because of it. But I think that there's value in at least acknowledging this wayward spirit that exists in yourself and all of those around you. And when something happens that seems a little bit sideways, it seems a little less than ideal, the acknowledgement that that is, for whatever reason, a pinch of salt in the stew that is humankind. It gives it a little bit of texture, a little bit of extra flavor, certainly additional dimensions to one's personality and focus and experience. And that this is something that exists in all of us, whether you want to admit it or not. Even if you look at purported sages and gurus and that sort of thing, there's always something that they have, some addiction that they are perceived to have to, smoking, or they have some addiction to food, or they have a lot of partners and lovers. There's always this sort of, salt in the mixture. I don't really know how else to say it. And that sometimes that can come out in ways that drive things away, right? And here's what's happening in this poem. And then the other thing that I want to talk about that this raises very, very nicely is this sentiment of rebirth and return to what was. He very directly says, now it returns. Compassion curves back here, and lightheartedness. So there's an acknowledgement of this idea that in its own way, all things are cyclical. And not because one cycles into the other, but because both of them come together. In Eastern philosophy, they would say there is not spring, and then spring becomes summer, summer becomes autumn, and autumn becomes fall. They would say there is spring, and then there is summer, and then there is autumn, and then there is fall. And it's not because one is driving into or cycling into the other. It's because they are all arising together. They all come into existence as one. And then because of the way that we experience things in this illusion, it's put in a chronological order, and we perceive it as time and chronology and one sort of begetting the other. But it's not. They came together. This is just how you're experiencing them. And in this way, the perceived cycle that Rumi is talking about, that love has gone away and now it returns, and it brings with it a compassion and a lightheartedness, right? The emptiness and the loneliness and the pain that you can feel when love leaves you because of something you may or may not have done, that embedded in that is the lightheartedness and the compassion that you will perceive as sort of a shift over time. But they are actually coming together because they are opposites, or they are at least angular cousins. If they're not 180-degree opposites, maybe they're 90-degree sort of tweaks or iterations. And so in this way, it throws all of these things back into motion, all of these things that are perceived as good, glorious, joyous things. A blind man throwing down his cane, a baby beginning to eat from a plate, right? All this growth, all this rebirth. And then this final acknowledgement, and the last point that I would say about this poem, now as silence unweaves this shroud of words we have woven. We've spoken about this many times. And it's funny because we're speaking about it. And it's funny because Rumi is writing about it. But there is a messiness and an incompleteness in all of these words that we're using to describe all the things that are happening. Right? He's beautifully describing this lost love and this wayward spirit, and then this rebirth and this reemergence of the love and the joy. And he's using words to do it wonderfully. But even he acknowledges at the end that a silence undoes all of those words. And why? Because in the silence, you can have the actual experience. And the word is a representation of the experience, but it is not a replacement for, or is not on the same level as having the actual experience. And so in this way, he very poignantly puts a bow on a beautifully worded poem that people would be very proud to have written, and says, this is still lackluster when compared to the actual thing. And that is the real reason why we try to quiet our minds and speak less, because it is in that silence that we can have true experience that's unburdened by the incompleteness of thinking or speaking about that experience in words.